I think a lot about what people say about the church, and the letter that the so-called leaders of the churches in England sent, well, I don't even know if they sent them to, well, they certainly didn't send them to me, and I'm one of the organisers of the events, but the letters that those church leaders, the public letters that those church leaders published about the Unite the Kingdom rally, they're reprehensible, you know, absolutely reprehensible. And I thought about what Tommy said. Tommy was being interviewed by one of the writers, a Jewish gentleman, one of the writers for The Spectator, Jonathan someone or other. Can't remember his full name. But, and he said this to him. He said, look, he said, when he was in prison, he says the pastor that managed to speak to him, the pastor that got through was, well, first of all, he was Asian, which I thought was fantastic. He was an Asian guy, but he said he was a geezer, he was a lad, he was from the street. And I thought about that, and I thought, what the church does is, it really does, to a great extent, I've got to be careful what I say here. I'm not about the true church. I'm on about the sort of sissified woke church, not the masculine, muscular Christianity that we need, but the very, very wet, limp-wristed, lame version of church, which isn't church at all. And what we need is a church on the street. And there's a lad I see preaching, I think he's in Newcastle, big lad, and he preaches the gospel, and he's fearless, and he's out there relentlessly. I hope he's still doing it, I hope he's still going on with God. But I've seen him a few times on YouTube, seen other people on YouTube out in the street. I used to do that for years. Had people spit in my face, had people attack me, and listen, I was a lot more capable then of fighting back than probably I am now, and I still wouldn't back down from too many men now. But when I had a Bible in my hand, never retaliated. In fact, everything I've done in the movement, I've never actually got involved in punching people or getting violent, because I've always felt God's protection. And that's not been a wimp, by the way. That's just doing what the Bible says and turning the other cheek. Someone comes up and punches you on the jaw, tries to punch you on the jaw, you've got every right to defend yourself. Every right to defend yourself. Turning the other cheek doesn't mean you become a doormat and let people kick you up and down the street. But it means that you use self-control and you don't get yourself into situations where you can, well, really get yourself into a terrible position, because there's a lot can go wrong. If you're fighting on the street, there's a lot can go wrong. And when I was a kid, probably it feels like this, from the age of 14 to 24, when I left the army, it felt like I had a fight every week. Probably didn't, but that's what it felt like. Fights in the army accommodation, fights in the blocks, fights in the NAFI, fights downtown, fights when I was back home in Middlesbrough. Before I went to the army, it was the same. Everybody was having a pop at each other. And that was just the culture I was brought up in. But when I became a Christian, I can safely say I've only had one, it wasn't really a fight, one violent incident that was not, I mean, obviously I've sparred and boxing and, you know, done karate and mixed martial arts, all that sort of stuff. But actually, a street fight, I haven't had one since I was 24. And, you know, it's a young man's sport. So when I'm talking about muscular Christianity, I'm not talking about people going out and being violent, but I'm talking about people being able to defend themselves. People being capable of fighting, but not fighting. You know, that whole idea of meekness, where you're capable of doing all sorts, but you don't do it because at the end of the day, you've got a better way of doing things. And jaw is better than war, for sure. As Russia's found out after its folly of attacking Ukraine, and the Ukrainians have found out, and Hamas have found out, etc., etc. War is not a good plan. And we've been blessed in the West with peace for a very long time. And when you think about Northern Ireland and the Troubles, Northern Ireland still bears the scars of what happened in the Troubles. And there's still a mentality in Northern Ireland that can explode very quickly. And in a way, that's a strength, because it means that people from Northern Ireland, communities in Northern Ireland, don't like getting pushed around and stand up for themselves, even if that means against the state. However, the reality of the situation is, what we never want to see is going back to the days of, turning on the news and there's another soldier, policeman, civilian, loyalist Republican killed, innocent people that maybe weren't innocent, but there was a lot of death and it left a deep scar. And my fear is that if we don't get this right with what we're doing in Unite the Kingdom, in all the other little movements that are going on, we could end up in that situation. And of course, we do have, I believe, we've got a fifth column in our midst, the Islamists, the communists. And how do we stand against that when the state isn't standing against it, and the politicians, the police, nobody's standing up for the little guy? So how do you fight back against that? And I think it's got to be through building community, not through being violent, but building community, building a community of strong, robust men that can box, that can fight, that have been in the military. I still think I think every young man between the age of 16 and 20 should have to do at least a year's military service and be taught about patriotism, military history, and the great things that the United Kingdom did. I think that would be a good policy. They don't have to go and fight. You're not sent on the front line. You let them do a year, let them do the training, get them trained up to a decent level, and if they've got a passion for it, they'll stay. If they haven't, well, then they'll go off on their merry way. But at least they'll have had discipline, patriotism, love of country, respect for women and kids, all those good things instilled into them, instead of just getting radicalised by the media, by the gangs. So there's things that we can do as a nation, there's things that we can do as Christians, there's things that we can do as our community with Unite the Kingdom, with the Pledge, with Advance UK. We can get people involved. But when we get power, and we need to get power, when we get power, I think some form of national service would be superb. And I also think there's a very strong argument for a government-raised Home Guard, something similar to the Ulster Defence Regiment or the Royal Irish Regiment Home Service Battalions. Because I do believe that we're going to be in a situation where the police ain't going to be able to cope, the army will be deployed, and if the state doesn't step into that vacuum, well then you're going to have vigilante groups and all sorts of stuff propping up. And that's the last thing we want. So yeah, I know a lot of that's quite a sort of rambling video, but I'm just thinking out loud how we fulfill our mandate as men, how we do what's required of us. And of course it all starts at the basic. It starts relationship with God, relationship with your family, love for your family, protecting your family. And then it expands out there, from there to community and town and city and county and so on and so forth. And that's why people have those tribal loyalties to their football teams. That's why every Englishman should support England. every lad from Middlesbrough, for all the pain and tribulation of it, should support Middlesbrough. If you're from Bangor, which is a town I live in, you should go and you should support your local team. Now, I'm not born here, and one of the interesting things is, because I'm not born in Northern Ireland, I've lived here most of my life, a lot longer. I've lived here a lot longer than I lived in England, but never lost my English accent, and I've never lost my love for England and my love for the football team, and the rugby team for that matter. Not so much rugby, but certainly football. And I think that's an interesting thing, because when we have people coming into our country, as much as they want to be part of the gang, if they do, I mean, a lot of them don't, and that's an even bigger problem. But the reality is, there's something about the country that you were born in, that your forefathers are buried in the ground of that country. There's something about that. There's something very powerful about that. And I love Northern Ireland, and I'd never leave Northern Ireland. But my roots are in England, and my kith and kin are under the ground in England. Unless they got cremated, of course, but they're still probably under the ground because the ashes get scattered. Anyway, let's get a bit morbid. But yeah, so I think we need to realise that those ties, and that's why we've got a problem in the UK, because particularly well, I'm not going to name the communities. There are some communities in England, in the UK, predominantly in England, whose loyalties are split, and that's a big problem. That's a big problem. They're split on religious grounds, and they're split on national grounds, and that was one of the main things that caused the problem in Northern Ireland. That there's a split because of religion and because of nationality. And yeah, so that's. Just going to cross back over there. There's people doing a bit of work there. That's something I think we've got to really, really consider when we're thinking about how we solve the problems of the UK. Anyway, a bit of a rant. Went a bit all over the house on that one, but sometimes it's just good to talk and think while you're talking. And hopefully something comes out the other end that makes sense to somebody in the crazy world of the internet. And again, one of my main priorities in doing this is to try and make sure that our country stays peaceful, stays free, and stays Christian. See you all soon.